Okay, you guys asked for this. I don't know why you want a whole video of me bitching up a storm about this figure, but I got more than a few requests for this after the last video. I would have thought I've gone into my reasons for not liking this thing enough over the course of my channel, but I suppose it will be good to aggregate all my hate into one place. I'll just rip into the Earthrise Optimus then, shall I? Before I start this video, I want to get out in front of it and say that while I really don't like this figure, I think it's overall okay. But it has a ton of issues people don't talk about. So believe me, I have a lot of ammo to fire off against this thing in this video. Doesn't mean I think this is the worst thing ever. Like I said, it's okay. But this whole video is basically going to be an endless parade of me pointing out problems with the figure. Maybe some of them get a little nitpicky. Just wanted to warn you that that's what you're in for. Okay, so after my previous video, there were a contingent of people who said they finally understand what I mean when I say the proportions on this thing are trash. And then there was probably an equal number of people saying they still don't see what I mean, so pardon the redundancy. I know this is like the 5th or 6th time I've tried to explain this, so sorry if you've heard me say all this before. I will try to make this at least a little new. So I'm always complaining that the legs on this are too long and the resulting proportions are bad because of it. And people don't seem to understand what I mean by that. The problem here is that the hips and crotch are actually part of the thighs, meaning that this has mile-long legs and a tiny torso. So look at it this way. Here we have the Siege Prime. He has natural proportions because his legs are mounted beneath the crotch, resulting in the perception that his torso is this long and his legs are this long. Whereas with the Earthrise, since the groin is part of the legs, it makes his legs this long and his torso this long. He has no crotch, so he goes straight from stomach into legs, meaning his entire upper body, what should amount for half of his overall height, only reaches his knee. And before anyone says, alien robot, they can look like whatever they want. 1, it's not intentional. They did not try to do this. This was an accident. It's not part of Optimus's design. He never looked like this before. 2, it makes him stand out like a sore thumb since no other character has proportions like this. And 3, it's still ugly as sin. It doesn't matter that it's a fictional character that can look any way it wants to. It's awful, and that's all the reason I need to hate it. I really hope this is the last time I have to try to explain this. I really want this to be the time that people finally say, I finally see what you mean. You don't have to agree with me on this. I just want you to understand what I see in this. Then you get to his stumpy arms that are too short in the face of his massive robo-tits to actually bend past his pecs at all. Another point in the Siege figure's favor. But ignoring the proportions, how are we looking? Not very good, I'm afraid. There are a lot of problems here, so I don't get this figure's popularity. For starters, the paint is just dog shit. People are always crowing about the paint on this thing, but no, it's trash. Look at the grill and the chest stripe. They just assaulted this whole area with the same silver paint. Never mind the fact that the grill is supposed to be silver and the stripe white. Here, it's all silver. But it's also just so shitty. It's like mottled and lumpy. Detail is clearly being lost under a deluge of paint, and then it's bleeding onto the red plastic all over. Speaking of the red plastic, the red on this thing is just so much worse than the Siege. It's honestly a kind of weirdly dark and desaturated color for Optimus. The Siege was a nice, vibrant candy red. This isn't. The fists are painted a pretty blue, but it also kind of makes them stand out in a weird way since there isn't another color on him like this, and they end up shiny like they're covered in sweat. And then I have a total nitpick, but the insides of his elbows are like half gray. I completely get if this doesn't bother anyone but me, but it's something that I don't like. For me, I hate it, but this is pretty much a me issue. Then you have the insides and backs of his legs, and I just have to ask why this was all cast in gray plastic. I know the backs of the Siege's legs were gray as well, but for starters, you couldn't see any of that from the front like you can with this. But also, it was just much less overall, and those were some transformation hinges, and they were smaller still. Yet this, without any of those concerns, were made to be a bulky gray, and it's not because of the shared engineering, because the only part that is the same are the fronts of the shins. Everything else is new. And I have to point out what a terrible decision it was to have the shared engineering be here at all. These legs work out great for the Siege since they are there to match its transformation. The result was that these were very complex for shins, but the Earthrise here doesn't transform at all from the waist down, so cribbing this incredibly complex part resulted in a lot of workarounds, none of which were optimal being added to the figure's legs, and it really just seems expensive and pointless. Also, just look at how loosely the wheels hang off his legs. Am I the only one who thinks this is really ugly? And it leaves him with a vestigial weapon port on the one side of his one leg. To me, that's just weird and gross like a pimple you can stick a gun in. And then we get to Optimus's butt cheeks. Yes, I know these aren't mounted in the right spot to be his actual butt cheeks, but it's not funny to say his lower back tires. It's funny to say rubber butt cheeks. And yes, I know this part comes off, but that's parts forming, and if you know me, you know that's not an option. And 2, it's even uglier because it leaves behind the butt bracket. I'm sure a lot of you are annoyed that I gave the Siege Prime a pass on having a lot more kibble than this, but I'm freaking out about this thing's one piece of kibble when it's otherwise so clean. Well, I've used this analogy before, but it is the perfect analogy for the situation. Look at Clive Owen. He's got kind of a lumpy face. But you know what? No one's complaining about it because it's so consistent, that's just his face. And that's how the Siege Prime is. It's kind of got a lumpy design, but it's the whole thing. The legs have kibble, the arms have kibble, his sides have kibble, the back has kibble. It permeates the design aesthetic, and as a result, it makes it all kind of blend together well. But then you have the Earthrise. Outside of the floppy tires and the fact that his legs are largely gray when they shouldn't have been, this thing doesn't really have any kibble, except for the one single huge bit sticking off his ass. So, I view this as Ryan Reynolds with a horribly broken nose. It's otherwise the furthest thing from lumpy, and that just causes the one flaw to draw your attention even more. Not that this thing has only one flaw, it's just got one thing of kibble. Speaking of stuff I didn't blame the Siege for, but I do blame this for, the faux forming grill. Unlike that thing, where its faux forming was to change the material, this thing is just faux forming because they wanted Prime's grill to arch backwards, which there had to have been an easier way to do. And before anyone says that if they didn't do the faux forming, then his torso would have looked like this, I'm not suggesting they don't have the torso transform. Just because I'm saying that it shouldn't be doing the thing that it's doing, doesn't mean it needs to end up with Optimus Prime here. They could have had the sides fold in and have the grill push back. It didn't need to be a fake one. So yeah, I don't get the hype for this thing. People always talk about how perfect it is, but all I see are flaws. And somehow, the head even sucks too when it's straight off the Siege. For starters, they just didn't bother painting the actual face because they were lazy, but even worse is the paint job on the mouth plate. That might actually be the worst part of the whole figure. I mean, they just did not give half a shit while they were doing this. But y'all have seen my Optimus's face time and time again. You already know how bad it is. It's just so incredibly lazy that they didn't even bother making a new head. They just took the one off the Siege and put like a third the effort into it. As for accessories, these are also very lazy. Well, at least one of them is very lazy. His gun actually has a good amount of effort put into it. I mean, it's very wrong, but at least they tried more with this than on the Siege, and it at least looks imposing. On the other hand, fuck the trailer. This is possibly the dirtiest excuse I've ever seen to grift an extra $20 out of people. There's no way the actual material for this cost more than $1, and then it's 18 components with 4 screws and 2 pins, it's got 2 tampos running down its sides, and that's it. You could tell me that they had one employee assigned to assemble all the trailers, and I'd say, yeah, that makes sense. It probably took that guy like 1 week to make every trailer they've ever shipped with one of these things. I love that the Netflix version doesn't come with a trailer, instead 2 weaponizers who each would have cost $5, and yet they charged $30 for that version. Which is the version I recommend you get if you want this figure, since they aren't overcharging for it. Oh, and it comes with a stuck matrix because, for some people this thing falls right out. For me, I need tools to retrieve it. Posability on this figure is worse than the Siege. I know a lot of people had qualms with how the Siege posed, but quite frankly, yes, this is worse. Slightly above average on the head, but you can't cheat it for more down like with the Siege. Shoulders pull a 90, but so do the elbows, when the Siege got a good bit more in that area. Backwards butterfly on both, more range here though. Again though, overall, the arms are very restricted here by the chest. Wrist swivel with opening hands. This may matter to you, but like I've said before, hands like this don't really mean that much to me. His waist is very limited, whereas the Siege could pull a full 360. Legs kick forward just fine, and out to the side just fine, but the backwards kick is excessively limited. Knees bend really far, not quite as far as on the Siege, but they are close enough that I won't hold it against it. And then the feet are the exact same. So the neck, elbows, waist, backwards leg, and barely the knees are all worse than on the Siege. Whereas on the Siege, the shoulders were barely worse, the butterfly had less range, and the forwards on the hips were a good bit worse, plus no opening hands, but that's really unimportant. So on paper, they have basically the same number of faults in comparison to each other, but the Earthrise's whole upper body is knocked down several points by having the chest limit the range of everything. Like more backwards butterfly, who cares if that's possible when it means that the hand doesn't get past his chest? It looks terrible. Plus, this is another of those things you can't understand without feeling the two of them, but the joints on the Earthrise, while not terrible, are a lot grittier than the Siege and a lot less friendly to your machinations. It just doesn't want to work with you like the Siege does. So the Earthrise poses worse. Same number of flaws, but the flaws are more extreme, and everything is just hampered by its proportions in a way the Siege isn't. It's worse. Transformation on this thing is actually a pretty good one, even with the faux forming. It's pretty inventive and fun, everything is logical and intuitive, and then you get to the lower half of the body and that all stops, because nothing happens. He sits down, and that's his transformation once you hit the legs. You have a really good time with the upper body, ignoring the faux forming, and then the legs just phone it in hard. It's still fun, but man, the lower half of his body is just another lazy as shit aspect of this figure. And his alt mode is... I really don't like this. I struggle to say that it's bad, but it's very flawed. The 2 huge shoulder protrusions sticking off the back, the large gap in the bed that I know people are going to try to claim is accurate to real life, but isn't because it would run the whole length and not just here. The way the cab just stops and then it's just the legs. Seriously, the Siege had a part specifically designed to make the sides blend with the cab, and they got rid of it for literally no reason. They only copied the wrong part of the legs. I'm going to be perfectly honest and very controversial here. I don't think the reason people like this thing is because it's good. I think people like this thing because they wanted an Earth mode Optimus, not a cyberpunk one, and this thing came out at the right time and it looked close enough. And because that's what they wanted to see, it blinded them to its negative qualities, leaving an impression of a better figure than it is. Again, it's not bad, but there are a heaping mess of faults layered on top of this thing. It is, in almost every single way, the inferior of its directly preceding figure. And none of that has to matter to you. If you like this thing, then I hope you never stop liking it. It doesn't have to be the best thing ever for you to like it. It doesn't even need to be good. It just needs to appeal to you. There's no shame in liking something that's not the best thing, or even liking a bad thing that you recognize as not being good. I made this video because people wanted to see me talk about the reasons I say this isn't as good as the previous figure. And if you feel that I've proven that to you finally, that doesn't have to change anything about the way you feel about this figure. Continue loving it, please. I don't ever want to be the cause of you no longer enjoying something you own. But I hope I finally talked about this thing enough. I hope I finally, in a satisfying way, finally explained my view on this thing enough. Because I'm tired of thinking up new ways to explain myself on this guy. And that's not half what I have to say, but it's enough what I have to say. And I know you know what everyone else tells you to do at the end of these videos. So, if you liked what you saw here, please do that. And if you'd like to take it a step further, then please share this video with any friend you think may be interested. I hope you all enjoyed listening to me waste your time.